History is not silent about its monsters. It screams their names from the pages of dusty books, preserves their cruelties in stone monuments, and whispers their sins across generations. Their legacies, however terrible, are carved into the memory of the world as a warning. But for one man, silence was the intended punishment. An absence. A void where a life once was. In the immediate bloody aftermath of his assassination in 41 A.D., the Roman Senate gathered in a state of panicked relief. They did not just celebrate the death of a tyrant, they attempted to commit a murder on history itself. They passed a decree of damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. It was an order to erase a man from existence. Statues were to be toppled and smashed. His face, once plastered across the empire, was to be chiseled away from public reliefs. Coins bearing his image were to be recalled and melted down. His name, a name once spoken with trembling fear and highest reverence, was now a crime to speak in public. It was to be struck from all official records, from every inscription, from every archway. The goal was simple and absolute, to make it as if the third emperor of Rome had never been born. Who was this man, whose reign was so catastrophic, so profoundly terrifying, that the most powerful empire in the world felt it had to pretend he never existed? His name was Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. History remembers him by the cruel nickname his father's soldiers gave him as a child, Caligula, Little Boot. A trivial, almost endearing name for a man who would later declare himself a living god and plunge Rome into a fevered dream of sadism, sexual horror, and absolute madness. The Senate's attempt to erase him failed. It failed because you cannot erase a nightmare. You cannot chisel away a trauma from a nation's psyche. In fact, their very attempt to create a void only made the specter of Caligula larger, darker, more legendary. They inadvertently created a mystery that has haunted historians for 2 millennia. This is the central question of his reign, a question that echoes from the ruins of his palaces. Was Caligula born a monster, or was he meticulously, brutally crafted into one? Was his madness a genetic flaw, a seed of insanity that was always destined to bloom? Or was he the perfect, horrifying product of a system drenched in trauma, paranoia, and limitless power? To answer this, we must become historical detectives, peeling back the layers of propaganda and legend. Our guides are the ancient chroniclers, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Tacitus. Their accounts, often written decades after his death by men with their own political agendas, are filled with scandal, sensationalism, and moral outrage. They are not unbiased, but they are all we have. They are the surviving witnesses to a psychological collapse of epic proportions. This will not be a simple recitation of his crimes. This will be a psychological autopsy. We will journey deep into the fractured mind of an emperor who waged war on reality itself. We will explore how a childhood steeped in unimaginable loss and fear created the foundation for a man who knew no empathy. We will witness how a sudden, crushing weight of absolute power and godlike adoration did not merely corrupt him, it shattered him. And we will examine how his infamous sexual rituals were not just acts of debauchery, but terrifying symptoms of a mind in freefall. A mind that sought to obliterate the rules of man by acting out the fantasies of a cruel, capricious god. The senators wanted to erase the story of Caligula. We are here to tell it, because his story is more than just a litany of horrors. It is a timeless and chilling warning. It is the definitive case study of what happens when a broken soul is handed the entire world. And our story begins not with the monster, but with the boy who was forced to watch his entire world burn. Before the monster, there was a myth. A shining, perfect myth. He was the son of Germanicus, Rome's most beloved general, a man so popular that his own emperor, Tiberius, was consumed with jealousy. He was the great-grandson of the divine Augustus. Born in a military camp, raised among the legions, he was the army's darling, their little mascot. They gave him his nickname, Caligula, after the miniature military boots, the caligy they had fashioned for him. He was, by all accounts, a golden child, the last hope of a noble lineage, and the living embodiment of Rome's future glory. This myth was the first lie of his life, and beneath its shimmering surface, a tragedy of almost Shakespearean proportions was unfolding. The very system that elevated his family was systematically, ruthlessly devouring it. The architect of this destruction was the reigning emperor, Tiberius. Old, paranoid, and ruling from his secluded island fortress on Capri, Tiberius saw threats in every shadow, and no shadow was larger than that of Germanicus's family. After Germanicus's own suspicious death in the east, Tiberius, goaded by his monstrous praetorian prefect Sejanus, turned his attention to Germanicus's widow, Agrippina the Elder, and her sons. What followed was not a swift execution, but a slow, calculated psychological vivisection. For a young Caligula, it was a masterclass in terror. He saw his mother, a proud and defiant woman, arrested and exiled to a barren island, where she was reportedly beaten so severely that she lost an eye before being starved to death. He saw his older brother Nero Caesar, declared an enemy of the state, exiled, and driven to suicide. He saw his other brother Drusus Caesar, imprisoned in the dungeons of the Palatine Hill, chained and fed just enough to prolong his agony until he died, allegedly trying to eat the stuffing from his own mattress. Caligula, the youngest son, was spared. Spared not out of mercy, but for a more sinister purpose. He was kept alive as a political pawn, a solitary survivor in a dynastic wasteland, a living reminder of Tiberius's absolute power. He was a prince raised in a slaughterhouse, taught from the earliest age that love, family, and ambition were invitations to annihilation. The primary lesson of his childhood was a brutal one. To survive, you must feel nothing, trust no one, and show nothing of the rage festering inside you. At the age of 19, this traumatized young man was summoned by the spider at the center of the web. He was called to Capri to live alongside the emperor who had murdered his family. Capri was not a palace. It was an academy of perversion and paranoia. According to the historian Suetonius, Tiberius had transformed the island into a private theater of depravity. It was a place where spies lurked around every corner, where summary executions were a daily occurrence, and where the emperor, old and withered, indulged in increasingly grotesque sexual spectacles, allegedly using specially trained children he called his little fishes. This was Caligula's university. He spent his days in the presence of a man who held the power of life and death over him, a man who could order his execution on a whim. He learned to navigate a world of constant, simmering threat. He studied the art of anticipating the moods of a tyrant. He witnessed firsthand that ultimate power meant the absolute right to indulge any fantasy, no matter how cruel or debased. On Capri, he learned that the line between pleasure and pain was a matter of perspective, and that morality was a foolish game played by those who were not yet in charge. His survival there was a miracle of acting. He donned a mask of perfect submission. He was attentive, obedient, and cheerful. He never spoke of his dead mother or brothers. He showed no resentment, no ambition. He played the part of the fawning, harmless nephew so convincingly that he became a favorite. Suetonius writes that he was the most artful of flatterers, a young man who had perfected the art of hiding his true self. But this performance came at a terrible psychological cost. It created a profound schism in his identity. Outwardly, he was the affable prince. Inwardly, he was a cauldron of suppressed grief, white-hot fury, and an unquenchable thirst for the power that would ensure he would never be a victim again. The mask was his shield, but beneath it, his soul was curdling into something monstrous. Tiberius himself was not fooled. He is famously quoted as saying that in Caligula he was nursing a viper for the Roman people. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD and Caligula was named his successor, the viper was released from its cage, but it emerged into a world of blinding, ecstatic light. Rome exploded in celebration. The dark, fearful reign of Tiberius was over. The son of the beloved Germanicus had returned. The people saw him not as a new emperor, but as their savior. They called him our baby, our star, our good luck charm. Sacrifices were made in his name. His every word was treated as gospel. The treasury, which Tiberius had hoarded, was thrown open for lavish games and public works. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if a golden age had dawned. The public adoration was total, suffocating, almost divine. And for a mind already warped by trauma, paranoia, and the deep psychological split of his survival, this level of worship was not just intoxicating, it was reality-bending. He wasn't being treated like a man, he was being treated like a god. And perhaps, deep down, he started to believe it. This impossible pressure, the weight of being a nation's messiah, was placed upon a psychological foundation that was already fractured beyond repair. Then, just 7 months into his celebrated reign, the foundation cracked. Caligula fell gravely, mysteriously ill. The entire empire fell into a state of collective mourning. Citizens held vigils outside the palace, praying for his recovery. The Golden Prince, their star, was fading. Then, against all odds, he recovered. He emerged from his sickbed. But the man who returned was not the same one who had fallen ill. The charming, generous, and affable ruler was gone. In his place stood something colder, more volatile, and infinitely more dangerous. The historians all mark this as the definitive turning point. The illness, whatever it was, had acted as a catalyst. It was the moment the immense pressure of his past and present collided. The moment the mask he had worn for a lifetime finally melted away. And the moment the viper Tiberius had warned them about began to uncoil. The performance was over. The true reign of Caligula was about to begin. The illness was a crucible. It took the fractured psyche of Caligula, the traumatized orphan, the terrified survivor, the adored demigod, and fused them into a new, terrifying whole. The man who emerged from the sickbed had come to a profound, reality-shattering conclusion. He had faced death and survived. Mere mortals, in his view, did not do that. Only gods did. The adulation of the Roman people was no longer just flattery. It was a simple statement of fact. His brief, shining performance as a benevolent human ruler was over. Now he would rule as he truly was, a living deity, unbound by the pathetic rules of mankind. This was not just a political calculation. It was the ultimate psychological defense mechanism. A god cannot be a victim. A god cannot feel the terror of a helpless boy watching his family being destroyed. A god does not live in fear of assassins in the shadows. By embracing divinity, Caligula attempted to surgically remove the traumatized human part of himself. He was performing an autopsy on his own soul and discarding the weak, wounded organs. From this point forward, his infamous sexual rituals were no longer private perversions. They were public performances of his divine status, each one a calculated sermon on his limitless power and his contempt for human morality. His first and most enduring sermon was on the subject of incest. The Roman historians, particularly Suetonius, speak with breathless horror of Caligula's relationships with his three sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla, and his favorite Drusilla. They report that he engaged in sexual relations with all of them, openly and without shame, often at lavish public banquets, in full view of horrified guests. While this was scandalous to Roman sensibilities, for Caligula, it was a theological statement. He was not breaking a human taboo, he was emulating divine precedent. The gods of the Greek and Roman pantheon were a famously incestuous family. Zeus was married to his sister, Hera. The Ptolemaic pharaohs of Egypt, who styled themselves as living gods, had married their siblings for centuries. For Caligula, sleeping with his sisters was the ultimate expression of his family's elevation above the mortal coil. It was a holy act, a way of keeping the divine bloodline pure and demonstrating that the Julio Claudians were not bound by the same fleshly constraints as their subjects. His relationship with Drusilla was the centerpiece of this new theology. He adored her, not merely as a sister or a lover, but as his divine equal. He treated her as his wife, despite both of them being married to other people. He named her his heir, a completely unprecedented act that placed a woman above the entire Roman Senate in the line of succession. When she fell ill and died suddenly in 38 AD, his reaction was not that of a grieving brother, but of a god whose other half had been torn away. He plunged the empire into a period of mourning so severe that it was a capital crime to laugh, bathe, or even dine with one's family. He then had her officially deified. She became Diva Drusilla, the first Roman empress to be consecrated as a goddess. He built temples in her honor and established a priesthood to oversee her worship. In death, he gave her what he was already claiming for himself in life. In loving and deifying his sister, he was loving and deifying himself. Having established his own family as a divine pantheon, his next target was the Roman elite, the senators and aristocrats who represented the old order. These were the men who had stood by silently while his mother and brothers were destroyed. His revenge upon them would be a campaign of systematic, sexualized humiliation, designed to prove that their honor, their families, and their very bodies were his personal property. His most infamous creation was the imperial brothel. According to both Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Caligula converted a section of the palace on the Palatine Hill into a fully operational, high-end brothel. But the women forced to work there were not common prostitutes. They were the wives and daughters of the most respected senators and equestrians. Invitations were sent out to these noble families, which were, in effect, commands. Heralds were dispatched across Rome to advertise the new attractions, openly naming the noblewomen available within. Caligula would reportedly wander the halls, personally acting as a barker, critiquing the women's performance to potential clients. This was not a business venture born of greed. It was a meticulously crafted ritual of degradation. The Roman elite's identity was built on the concept of dignitas, dignity, and the purity of their family lines. By turning their wives and daughters into public commodities, Caligula was attacking the very core of their identity. He was demonstrating, in the most visceral way imaginable, that their precious lineage was meaningless, their honor was a fiction, and that he, the god emperor, had the ultimate right of ownership over their flesh. It was a psychological masterstroke, a form of revenge far more intimate and soul-crushing than simple execution. He wasn't just killing them, he was making them live with their own public disgrace. This theme of public humiliation was a constant feature of his reign. His banquets became infamous arenas of sexual power plays. A popular and likely exaggerated story tells of how Caligula would often pause a meal, calmly walk over to the wife of a high-ranking guest, and take her to an adjacent room. He would then return to the table, while her husband was forced to sit in stony silence and loudly, publicly, critique her performance in bed, detailing her flaws or merits for all to hear. Whether these specific events happened exactly as described is a matter of historical debate, but the consistency of the theme across multiple sources points to a core truth. Caligula used sex as a weapon of terror and an instrument of power. For him, the act itself was secondary. The primary goal was the assertion of his divine prerogative. A god does not ask for permission. A god takes what he wants when he wants it. Every woman he took, every family he disgraced, every taboo he broke was another brick in the temple he was building to himself. He was forcing the Roman world to participate in his personal mythology, casting them as the helpless mortals in the epic drama of his own divinity. But as his sense of godhood grew, so too did his detachment from reality. The line between asserting divine power and succumbing to pure, chaotic madness was beginning to dissolve. As Caligula's reign progressed, his psychological rupture widened into an unbridgeable chasm. The logic, however twisted, that had underpinned his initial acts of divinity began to fray and disintegrate. What replaced it was a terrifying and unpredictable vortex of sadistic cruelty, black humor, and pure, absurdist theater. His mind, now fully untethered from the constraints of human reason, no longer sought just to dominate reality. It sought to mock it, to twist it into grotesque shapes for his own amusement. The emperor was no longer just a god. He was a mad god, a divine nihilist, and his actions became less about asserting power and more about demonstrating its utter meaninglessness. The most famous symbol of this descent into the absurd is, of course, his horse, Incitatus. The story, as told by Suetonius and Cassius Dio, has become the defining legend of Caligula's insanity. Incitatus was no ordinary steed. He was treated with a reverence befitting a high-ranking nobleman. He had a stable made of marble, a manger of ivory, and was fed oats mixed with gold flakes. He was draped in purple blankets, the color of royalty, and wore a collar of precious stones. He had his own retinue of servants, and would even invite dignitaries to dine with him at the palace, where they were forced to make polite conversation with the guest of honor. This, on its own, was eccentric enough to raise eyebrows. But Caligula took it a step further. He announced his intention to make Incitatus a consul, the highest elected office in the Roman Republic. This was the act that, for many, confirmed his absolute madness. But to dismiss it as simple insanity is to miss the terrifying genius of its symbolism. This was not a random act of a lunatic. It was a calculated, profound act of political and social satire. The Roman Senate, the institution that had once conquered the world, had been reduced to a rubber-stamping body of terrified sycophants. By suggesting his horse was qualified for their highest office, Caligula was holding up a mirror to them. He was saying, "You are so useless, so devoid of real power, so utterly subservient to my will that my horse could do your job." In fact, he would be a more honest politician than any of you. It was the ultimate gesture of contempt, a Dadaist masterpiece of political theater that exposed the rotting core of the Roman elite. He was mocking their traditions, their honor, and their entire system by demonstrating that it had all become a joke. As his contempt for humanity grew, so did his appetite for casual cruelty. The logic of revenge that had fueled his initial attacks on the Senate gave way to a detached, almost scientific curiosity about suffering. His sexual sadism became less about humiliation and more about the raw exercise of life and death power. He reportedly had mirrors installed in his private chambers, including on the ceiling, not just for erotic purposes, but to watch his own contortions during acts of debauchery, as if he were a specimen in his own experiment. He began to view human beings not as subjects or even as victims, but as material, as flesh to be manipulated for his entertainment. The dinner parties, once stages for political humiliation, became laboratories of horror. Suetonius claims that Caligula would have prisoners tortured and executed in front of his dining guests, turning gruesome death into a form of after-dinner entertainment. He found the sounds of suffering to be a delightful appetizer. He took pleasure in ordering executions with absurdly specific and cruel instructions, such as demanding a man be killed with many small wounds so that he could feel himself dying. This was no longer about power. It was about the aesthetics of pain. His famous chilling quote, "Utinam populus Romanus unum servicem habere," "I wish the Roman people had but one neck," is the ultimate expression of this mindset. He reportedly uttered it in a fit of frustration at the immense effort required to manage and terrorize millions of individuals. The quote reveals a mind that has moved beyond tyranny into a realm of pure, abstract destruction. He longed for a world where he could extinguish all of humanity with a single, satisfying stroke, like a bored child knocking over a set of toy soldiers. This internal chaos was mirrored by his increasingly fragmented public persona. He was no longer content to be just one god. He began to appear in public dressed as a variety of deities, sometimes as Hercules, wielding a club, other times as Apollo, crowned with sun rays, or even as Venus, dressed in feminine silks. He would engage in long, one-sided conversations with a statue of Jupiter, sometimes arguing with it, sometimes whispering secrets to it. He reportedly held conversations with the full moon, inviting it down to his bed for a romantic encounter. His sense of self had shattered into 1,000 divine reflections. He was no longer Caligula the emperor. He was a walking, talking pantheon of his own chaotic imagination. The final act of this grand, absurdist play was his infamous invasion of Britain. In 40 A.D., he marched the legions to the shores of the English Channel, as if preparing for a grand conquest. He arranged the soldiers in battle formation, had them prepare the artillery, and created an atmosphere of immense tension. Then he gave the order. He commanded his soldiers to attack the sea itself. He ordered them to wade into the waves and fill their helmets with seashells, declaring them the spoils of the ocean, due to the Capitol and the Palatine. Historians have struggled to make sense of this. Was it a punishment for a mutinous army? Was it an elaborate joke? Or was it the ultimate act of a man who had declared war on the natural order of the universe? It was a gesture of pure, meaningless power. He couldn't conquer Britain, so he would conquer the ocean. He couldn't command the loyalty of men, so he would command them to perform an act of utter futility. It was the final, pathetic spectacle of a mind that had lost all contact with the world. A god-emperor whose only remaining power was the power to make everyone else a participant in his madness. The soldiers collecting shells on the beach were the final, tragic audience for a play whose author had forgotten the plot, the characters, and even his own name. A reign born in blood must end in it. The madness of a single man, no matter how absolute his power, cannot hold an entire empire hostage forever. Reality, which Caligula had so thoroughly mocked, tortured, and tried to rewrite, was about to reassert itself in the most brutal way imaginable. The final act was not set on a divine stage or in an absurdist theater, but in a grim, subterranean corridor of the very palace where he had staged his horrors. The breaking point came not from the Senate he had humiliated, nor from the people he had terrorized, but from the men who were sworn to protect him, the Praetorian Guard. For years, they had been the instruments of his cruelty and the witnesses to his escalating insanity. But Caligula, in his supreme arrogance, made a fatal error. He began to mock them too. He particularly targeted a senior officer named Cassius Dio. Dio was a veteran soldier, a man of dignity, but he had a high-pitched, effeminate voice, which Caligula found endlessly amusing. The emperor would publicly taunt him, calling him Priapus or Venus, and would give him obscene passwords for the daily watch, such as lust or embrace. For a proud Roman soldier, this was an unbearable and constant humiliation. In mocking Dio, Caligula had forgotten the most basic rule of tyranny. Never disarm a man while you are still insulting him. Dio, along with other disillusioned officers and a number of senators who saw their chance, began to plot. They were not just planning an assassination, they were planning a monster slaying. The conspiracy grew, drawing in men who were motivated by a complex cocktail of personal insult, political ambition, and a genuine fear that the emperor was about to drag the entire world into his personal abyss. The day they chose was January 24th, 41 A.D., the final day of the Palatine Games. After watching a performance, Caligula was making his way through a narrow, underground passage connecting the palace to the theater. It was here, away from the crowds and the bulk of his loyal German bodyguard, that the conspirators struck. Chaerea approached him and, according to the historian Josephus, asked for the password of the day. When Caligula gave him yet another lewd and insulting reply, Chaerea roared, "Then take this!" and struck the first blow. A sword slashed to the neck and shoulder. What followed was not a clean, swift execution. It was a frenzy of pent-up rage and terror. The other conspirators swarmed him. A man named Cornelius Sabinus struck him from the other side, bringing him to his knees. Pinned and helpless, the self-proclaimed god was butchered. The accounts claim he was stabbed more than 30 times. The conspirators reportedly screamed with each blow, "Strike again!" and "More!" They were not just killing a man, they were trying to kill a nightmare, hacking away at the source of their fear and humiliation. Suetonius reports that some even sank their teeth into the flesh of the dying emperor. In his final, agonizing moments, the living deity was reduced to a slab of meat, torn apart by the very wolves he had kept as his dogs. The chaos did not end there. In the moments after the assassination, a wave of brutal score-settling swept through the palace. The conspirators, knowing they had to eliminate his entire line, hunted down his family. They found his fourth wife, Millennia Caesonia, weeping over her husband's body. They ran her through with a sword. Their daughter, Julia Drusilla, a mere infant, was found in her nursery. In an act of chilling symbolic cruelty, a soldier snatched the baby and smashed her head against a wall. The bloodline of the monster had to be exterminated, root and branch. The golden family of Germanicus, which had begun the story as the hope of Rome, now ended in a blood-soaked nursery. This brings us back to where we began. The terrified Senate, the decree of damnatio memoriae, and the desperate attempt to erase the memory of the man-god. Their effort was a testament to the sheer psychological trauma Caligula had inflicted on Rome. His reign wasn't just a political failure. It was a deep, existential wound. He had held a mirror up to the Roman system and showed it a grotesque reflection. He demonstrated, with horrifying clarity, that the position of emperor, a position of supposedly limitless power, was a flaw in their design, a loaded gun that, if placed in the wrong hands, would inevitably be turned on Rome itself. He was the system's logical, insane conclusion. In the end, how do we judge him? The ancient historians who wrote his story were not neutral observers. They were men of the senatorial class, the very class he had so viciously targeted. They had every reason to paint him as the most depraved monster imaginable, to turn his story into a cautionary tale that justified their own power. It is entirely possible, even probable, that many of the most lurid stories, the orgies, the brothel, the incest, were exaggerated for political effect. But even if we strip away the layers of legend, even if only half of what was written is true, the figure that remains is still one of history's most terrifying case studies. The story of Caligula is the story of what happens when profound childhood trauma is given absolute power. It is an exploration of the terrifyingly thin membrane that separates civilization from chaos, reason from madness. He was not born a monster, but Rome, in all its glory and all its brutality, provided him with the perfect crucible in which to become one. The Senate tried to silence his story, but they failed. He remains, a screaming ghost in the halls of history, a permanent and chilling answer to the question, what is the true price of believing a man is a god?